Hey everybody, the coffee is hot. Welcome back to Great Mondays Radio. Today we're going to talk to business psychologist Dr. Camille Preston. She has been working with C-suite executives and their organizations for over 20 years, turning science and insights into action. And what I want to talk about with her today is getting into a little bit of some of the underbelly, perhaps, of some of the mood and the reactions that we've had to kind of this activating event around the pandemic, around the lockdowns, and kind of our collective response and what's happening and how do we work our way out of that. Camille Preston, amazing to see you. Thank you so much for coming on Great Mondays Radio.
Thank you. I'm excited. So many good topics there.
Yeah, there's a lot to get into. So we'll dive right in. So, you have a consulting firm called AIM Leadership, and you've been doing this for 20 years as a business psychologist. What I like to talk about is, or what I want to unearth are some of the things that are bubbling up for you, what you're seeing in conversations, some of the patterns and observations that you're making in the world. So you talked about, we started this by saying, I'm seeing a lot of the shadow side. Tell
Mm.
me about, define for our listeners, what are we talking about? And how is that term is kind of become, is sort of emerged into the popular lexicon. So let's define it for people and kind of get into it. What have you been seeing and what does it mean for us?
Yeah, no, fantastic. So Jung brought kind of the concept of the shadow to a Jungian psychologist, Carl Jung, brought shadow to the forefront. And he talks about ego, which is the part of our identity that we bring out into the world. And he also talked about this idea that we all have shadow, which is like um, things that are not maybe societally approved of, desires, those kind of parts of ourself that we like to keep hidden or in the closet, kind of under covers. And it's interesting because over the last 3 to 4 years, we've started to see both a lot of shadow emerge around us, but a lot of awareness about this side of ourselves and starting to explore and be curious. And I think, as you alluded to, it really starts likens back to the pandemic when people went inside away from their friends, relationships thinned, we have this loneliness epidemic. There was so much time alone that parts of ourselves bubbled up, and we're really starting to see that more around us, um, for better or for worse.
Mhm. Yeah, so that includes in the business, right?
Mhm.
So that's what's interesting. You're not just a psychologist, you're a business psychologist. And so and that's what we're concerned with. That's what we're thinking about. So what does it mean? What is the implication for organizations that this has been has started to emerge and that there's a tendency, I think, and of course, correct me because this is not my expertise. There's a tendency for people to be leaning into their shadow selves. Is that the right way to say it?
Um, I think I'd go back a little bit earlier. So I've been in business for, over 20 years, but it was only in the like 2017 that I actually started calling myself a business psychologist on the urging of a client. And what was really surprising to me was how much psychology and specifically mental health came into the workplace. And again, whether that was kind of a societal shift or something that happened with the pandemic, but I saw so many businesses having to bring mental health to the forefront. Like it all of a sudden became a manager's responsibility to care for your team holistically, especially when people
Yep.
were isolated, where people were away. And I remember my husband, who's at MIT's Sloan Business School, saying, I just never thought this was going to be my job responsibility. Like I'm like a homeroom mother sometimes. Like I have to
Yes.
take on all of this. And he shared, he gets very involved in members of his team's lives, not because he wants to, but because he feels they need support moving through things to be able to be their best version of themselves at work. And I think we see that in a lot of places where there is, as relationships thinned, more of the workplace became more of a family and more of the relationships came online. So I think mental health came up as one thing, but then an awareness of anxiety and depression and isolation and loneliness is like all of a sudden a lexicon. Like,
We couldn't hide it anymore.
yeah,
And I want to just add that I think a common experience that we all had that you pointed out, which is it's not that these things didn't exist prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic, you said it sort of thinned out
debated.
everything. We didn't have the capacity or the infrastructure internally, the emotional infrastructure to continue to hide it. And that's what emerged, for better or worse, and worse. Maybe we should say that, for worse and maybe better, might say Dr. Preston.
And people are starting to address, like, there's a whole body of literature about how technology is changing us, and that was my first book, but I think it's good that we're having these conversations. I think another example of this, Josh, is the idea of burnout. Like, burnout is not a new concept, but it came online and then we started talking about all different types of
It
burnout.
became very evident. We could no longer sweep it under the rug, so to speak.
Yeah. And so the shadow work is very emergent. It's definitely something that people are just starting to explore. And I think from a culture perspective, it's about having your eyes wide open and seeing things as they are, seeing, what's working well, what could be working better. Two sides of the same coin. And
Mm,
starting to ask those questions and see what it is. Some of it's appropriate for the workplace, some of it's appropriate to be referred out to an EAP or what have you. Um, but I think as culture experts, we are watching people and we are looking for patterns and we're looking for opportunities to help people be the best version of themselves. What is the culture that we need? How do we, this is a concept that I love, which is before the beginning, right? The problem's there. What's underneath that problem is another way of
mm,
exploring that.
mm, mm. So I I struggle. So a practical response that I have seen, and something that I'm struggling with just having empathy for, are managers who or leaders who are pushing back and saying, honestly, that's not my job. Like, there was a lot of, like, pandemic, post-pandemic, here's mental health resources, here's what we can provide for you. And I think there's two pieces. There's the um folks that maybe it's not explicitly like, hey, let's not do that, but just not investing in mental health resources. But then there's also the manager, like you said, your husband, where you're like, what am I doing here? This is not what I signed up for. And I wonder if you can help me understand what is and what is not. And it's going to be different for everybody, but let me finish the sentence. What is and what is not the responsibility of a leader or a manager when it comes to dealing with these kinds of things, whether you want to categorize it as mental health or not, but the external piece, the parts of the human that haven't up until now been part of the conversation.
Yeah. I think it's a great question. And it's a really unique microcosm that we will probably go back and study for years
Yeah.
of what happened. Because I think I remember seeing this bifurcation of leaders right around March 2020, where some leaders were like, yeah, I didn't know this was coming, but I've been to the metaphoric gym. I've been building my capacities. I've been building my skills. I've been diversifying my capacity to communicate. I've built out a really strong culture. I have incredible relationships. This is new. I didn't choose it, but I'm gonna thrive. And then you saw other people who maybe had a lot of deferred maintenance on their leadership skills that all of a sudden were scrambling and like,
Leadership debt.
yeah. And it was interesting because I think so. I think to answer your question, it starts first within. And this is why I'm often working with executives and then their teams, building
Mhm.
skills, building a mindset, building a tool, building the language to be able to say, how do we talk about trust? What does it mean to manage urgency? How do we have healthy conflict? All of those are skills that we build in initially in ourselves before we bring those to our teams. And we lead by example in building that culture of healthy practices.
Mm.
And so I think COVID was really interesting because, right, you saw this bifurcation of like people who had been to the leadership gym and people who hadn't. But then you also saw relationships and how they evolved. Sometimes organizations really invested in continuing the relationships and people coalesced. And other organizations were like, we have pretty good relationships. And they went on as business as normal. And then they saw a lot of churn in their cultures. And so you'll start to see these patterns evolve. Is that responsive to your?
Yeah, I want maybe you can't provide it, right? I think what I realize I'm asking for is like, how do I make the case, or how might one make the case to say this is part of your responsibility? And I realize it's not, it is a very big task to like convince a leader who's like, no way to be, but it's like the way, how about this? The way
Can
that
I just want to respond to that.
okay, go.
When you've experienced someone having your back and being willing to like carry you, and that sounds deficit based. When someone has seen what you're capable of and believed into you what they think you're capable of, and you've risen to the occasion, we all know those, we all have those
Yeah.
experiences. I'm still in touch with my soccer coach from third grade, Don Crawshaw. He's in his 90s. He did that for me, right?
Yeah.
Like he saw me and he believed in me, and you would see the possibility. So I think one is having had the experience. The second thing is recognizing people when they do it, because it feels incredible to have invested in someone, not just because they're a worker bee on your team, and to see them flourish. Now that goes back to culture, celebrating the whole individual, right?
Mhm.
Psychological safety is about seeing the whole individual, not
Yeah.
just that you want to present. And that goes back to the shadow and the ego, right? Like
Yeah.
the ego is like what we want to present on the outside of like, I'm a rock star. Here's why I'm fabulous. We all have underbellies. We all are a combination. When we
Yeah.
can hold both of those, there's psychological safety. Am I
Yes.
you Pollyanna
Yes.
on
No,
that,
that's
but
even better. That's even better. That's even better. Yeah, that you answered the question. I love this this framing, and it really sums up kind of what we're talking about. And it's part of the hypothesis that I'm working with around this. And I've folks who have listened to the podcast and kind of follow some of the things that I'm doing, I'm really, really interested in the degradation of relationships and how that is coming to bear amongst teams. And as a matter of fact, the most popular thing I'm being asked to do the most is come in and share with organizations. How do you rebuild these relationships now that we're distributed, now that we're hybrid? Because everybody is starting to see the failure of efficiency in round teams, the failure of innovation, the failure of
yeah.
trust. And that, so it's heartening to hear that you're seeing it as well, because I do trust your opinion very deeply. And so this ability, one of the opportunities that I like to share around rebuilding is helping team members understand the whole person.
I just I
Right?
just wrote down whole self. I wanted to, yes,
Yeah. So
100%.
all right. So go ahead. So now I've revved you up. Take it
You
away.
did. I love it. I mean, you and I are, it's funny, we haven't seen each other for 15 years and we're singing from the same songbook of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
authenticity and genuine relationships and building rapport and creating those connections in ways that people didn't appreciate in the past because they were face to face. Now that they're apart, we have to be intentional about creating that rapport, creating that authenticity, understanding and investing in the relationship before you need it, right? You're going to
Yeah.
need to influence without authority, but you need to be in relationship to be able to navigate that. We
Mhm.
have to unlearn things we might have heard from past generations and relearn what it means to be authentic, to be vulnerable in a way that you get to know who I am, but not
Mhm.
in a way that's inappropriate. Like all of that is some new discomfort. The second part that I think you're hitting on about the whole self is for so many years, we over indexed on cognitive intelligence, like logic, reason, science. And now we're seeing that so much wisdom is inexperienced, is in felt intuition. And when you bring people together and they feel safe, they can tap into that wisdom. I recently read a podcast or a blog about birds. And when birds are singing, they only sing when they feel safe, unless it's like a warning song. And so we often hear bird song and we feel relaxed. And then they're creating something beautiful. We're just like them. We have to feel some level of safety to bring our music to the table and our full self.
Mhm.
And I think like the wisdom is cognitive, emotional, physical, learned, experienced knowledge. And that's a huge thing for corporations to shift from. It's so much easier to say, McKinsey said this, Bain said that, the data says this,
Show me the
but
data.
might not always be the
Prove
right
prove
thing.
it to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'd be curious your take on what do you think companies need the most to really invest in these rebuilding of the teams, rebuilding a shared language, rebuilding that connective fabric?
It's to me, step one is the awareness of that they need to actually intentionally, proactively build the skill. Leaders, managers, even teammates need to build the skill to help them and their teams create these relationships and trust, because previously that just happened, quote unquote, automatically. Now, it probably wasn't the highest quality, but it wasn't at such a deficit that it was falling apart. Teams would kind of tend to gravitate together. They tend to work together, or they would see each other more often, or share the workspace, or get together. And now that they don't, we have to learn how to do this from scratch. We've never had to do this before. Now, I have had and have seen great leaders who have intentionally built these relationships, causing the trust. Previously, that's what they had done. They had intuited that. Now it's the water level has sunk, right? We've drained all the water from the ocean. We're no longer naturally buoyant. And so we all have to learn how to invest in these relationships. And here's the key: put the energy in. Decide to take part of our limited energy and invest it. Our tendency as humans is to be more efficient and say, well, I need to do other things. But the truth of the matter is, we're seeing what happens when you don't have those relationships. And that is problematic. And what I want to make sure, I would say success would be if more leaders were able to understand that the team's performance, or the lack thereof, is not inherently because they're distributed. It's because the relationships aren't there. That's what I want to point out to folks. That's going to make the biggest difference. Otherwise, you're just going to get folks, leaders and CEOs saying, see, you have to be back in the office 5 days a week, which for
Yep.
some organizations is fine, but that's not, we have to be smarter than that. We have to understand that there's other things happening, and we can move forward. We can evolve
Yep.
if we understand what's happening.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I think I would add to what you're saying and just circle back to the whole self. Like you can go into the intellect and give people the cognitive models. What is trust? What builds trust? What do you need to do? Intellectually, that's a logical process, but then
Mm-hmm.
you need that experiential
Mm.
container that can hold you while you do some things that are a little uncomfortable and bring parts, bring your parts, bring forth parts of yourself that create that authenticity. One of the things I'm playing a lot with is this idea that tension creates consciousness and consciousness creates tension, right? It's
Whoa. Hold on.
uncomfortable.
Let me hang on. Let me absorb that. Tension creates consciousness, and consciousness creates tension. Okay, say
It's
more.
cycle. So just like the shadow, it's uncomfortable to shine a light on a part of ourself that we don't love, right? A part of ourself that is societally not accepted, like to see ourselves kind of with some compassion. When we can hold the light and see that and kind of accept that this is part of us, we can then open to a new set of skills and new ways of acting. I think two things typically happen. We're uncomfortable with tension. And so we jump into action, or we change the topic, or we
Mm-hmm.
get really busy, or we scroll, or we shop, or we do whatever we do to get out of the tension. But if we can learn to be present with that tension, we all of a sudden open to all these new skills within ourselves. And again, it goes back to culture. You need a culture where it is safe to be in that
It's
tension.
acceptable.
Yeah. And to be like, wait a minute, that's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer. Let me think about it. Let me come back to you. Right. And have that kind of healthy dialogue. Um, you asked a question that I wanted to circle back to that is an example of this tension. And it was around this idea of what is the appropriate kind of level of awareness and service of leaders? And, um, sometimes it's hard to do. Leaders are asked to do hard things. Like that's why you're a leader. You're stepping into uncomfortable, challenging things that are new. And sometimes holding space for people creates tension. I think when you can help a leader see where they've been invested in or where there's a creative aspect, it reduces the tension and helps them stay connected to this person in their team that's asking
Mm.
for different things. And I think there's a fine line, and there's a lot of things that are not appropriate in the workforce in terms of like mental health. And like, I think your audience is clear on that. And I think caring is a really important thing that is your ability to care is going to become much more important. And, there was that statistic that says people judge you within 3 to 4 seconds of meeting you.
Mm-hmm.
And they say they judge you on two things. Do you know what those two things are?
I don't.
Um, are you kind and are you competent? Are you kind and are you competent? We spend so much energy trying to come off as competent, but people care. Are you kind? Like, are you safe for me to be who I am? Like, are you safe to engage?
It's a primitive, primal response, right? Are you a friend or a foe?
Yeah.
And kindness is that. It's not 100%, but it's like your intuition can tell you if that person is actually kind or if they're going to stab you in the back. Could be, primally that's that might be literally back, but now it still feels like that. Let's wrap up and share. I'm gonna give you a second to think about um if you would share one way that we can start to build one exercise or conversation, turning that intellect into action, that maybe you can share with the audience around how to start to build some more of that trust inside. And I'll start. I'll give you the time by starting. I'm just going to tell you a quick exercise that I do. That is uh, not something that I made up, but something that is, I think, very appropriate for the moment. And this goes back to understanding the whole person. And one of the exercises that I do, and I can spend hours on it, depends on how much time that we want to focus on, but I ask folks to break up into pairs and to practice active listening. And I have a series of questions that people can ask, and then the we're not very good at just listening and not listening to understand, not listening to respond. And the questions will often be about things that are outside of your professional relationship. And then I have them swap. And the benefit is twofold. Well, it's probably multiple, but more than that. But the benefit is twofold. One is um, to be heard, to really be heard, is to be seen, and you feel that's all we want, is to be seen. And that's very present for me based on some kind of early childhood trauma, which I have become aware of. But it's also very important for, even if you don't have that, that's really important. I see you and I understand you, and therefore I'm going to build a little bit of trust. The other part is I'm actually learning about you as a whole person. Now, we can't get to the shadow side if we haven't built a little bit of trust. And so I organize those questions into 3 levels, right? Sort of very easy, kind of top tier, not very vulnerable, all the way to much more vulnerable about the work, about failure, about those things. And that's why I build people through. So that is how that's been the most effective exercise that I've engaged in order to help organizations begin to rebuild that trust.
That's a brilliant exercise because you're teaching listening, you're teaching compassion, you're teaching authenticity. You are actually practicing trust. Like how much am I gonna share of myself? So that's a brilliant activity. Um, and I think I've done something similar. I'm always amazed when people are like, can I take this? Can I use this with my team? I'm like, yes.
That's the point. What do you mean? Can you use this with the team? Yes.
Um, and those are great. You can do a virtual coffee, you can do a virtual walk, you can do a lot of fun things. I love your question and this idea of ideas into action, because that is insight without action is the booby prize of life. And that does not translate cross-culturally. I can tell you I made that mistake. Um, but it's so vital to come to a conversation like this and then say, okay, so what am I going to do differently?
Yeah.
What am I going to do? And um, and I think so one of the things we do a lot is these resources, right? Distilling ideas into very simple components. And you asked about trust. And we've based some of our work off of Michelle and Dennis Rainia's work. Trust is the intersection of trust of character, trust of competence, and trust of communication. Like, who are you? What do you stand for? What is your skill level? Can I trust you to do what you have committed to doing? And then will you speak with good purpose? Will you be transparent? Will you come to me before you come to other people? And your activity is really elucidating trust of character. Like, let me tell you about myself. You're learning how this person communicates. So you're building trust of, oh, this is how this person's patterns are. This is how this person talks. And then the trust of competence is where people can say, I'm really good at this and I'm really bad at this. And
Wait, I
I
have
think
character, competence. What's the other one that I missed?
communication,
Communication.
speak
Okay.
with good purpose. Are you willing to come to me first? The example of this is like, we've all been to those meetings where everybody's like, that's a great idea. That's fantastic. Sounds good. Uh-huh. They walk out the door and they're like, never going to happen. Never going to do that. Right. Like, no trust of communication. It's not safe to say, I'm not going to do that. Or someone who's like, yeah, I'm on target for this deadline. I'm on target for this deadline. Oops.
Yeah.
Um, so those three parts are really, really vital: trust of character, competence, and communication. And it's not that you're competent in everything. It's that we have the relationship where I can say, Josh, I'm really good at this. This is not my forte. I'm good at right. And I was working with the oldest and largest NGO in Afghanistan, August of 2010. And it was a very complex team. It was Taliban warlords, the first female judge. It was people who had survived Croatia. Like, it was a diverse team that we were trying to get online. And the colleague that I was working with, they said, would you trust him to get, if you needed open heart surgery? And I said, absolutely. And they were shocked. And I said, I trust his character, that he would do everything possible to find me a surgeon. I trust that he knows he's not competent to do heart surgery on me and he wouldn't try, right? And I trust that he has the skills to navigate. And
Yeah.
right,
Talk about
that's
that.
an example of how you think about that. So in terms of ideas into action, I would challenge your group to think of those three areas: character, competence, and communication, and start to notice where you feel the most tension. Maybe you think of a relationship where you have tension and find a little stillness to say, how can I hold this? How can I hold this tension and bring to the surface a new level of consciousness about their character, about their communication, or about their competence? Like, what do I need to do differently in that relationship? How can I engage with them differently? So that you're starting to build a little of your skill to step outside your comfort zone to navigate.
Well, I feel like I've been in an hour of therapy, but
But more fun than that, right?
more
Hopefully.
fun than that. Yes, yes. Therapy can be fun sometimes. Dr. Camille Preston, it is so good to see you. Thank you so much. If you would like to learn more about Camille, you can go to aimleadership.com. We'll put some links to her work in the show notes so you can follow up more. Camille, this was just so phenomenal with all this information. I'm gonna have to go sleep for a day and absorb it all. So it's amazing. Thank you so much for coming on Great Mondays Radio.
Thanks for having me. Nice to meet your team.